So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. If you're here to see or listen to the presentation, the STAY interviews, the what, why, and how from the Osborne Group. What we're going to cover today is I'm going to welcome all of you, so welcome. I'm going to introduce the presenters. We're going to talk about the benefits of STAY interviews, the challenge with STAY interviews. Judy, one of our principals, is going to do an executive level perspective, and then we'll answer any questions that you may have. If you have questions during the presentation, if you want to put your hand up, we'll try and address them. If it's something we're about to speak to, then we might make you wait. But often with these topics, if they're new to you, you might want to ask the question when it occurs to you rather than wait until the very end of the presentation. So just a little bit about the Osborne Groups, if you're not familiar with us, we're experienced executives, and we basically provide two different services. One is we provide interim executive services, and we've been doing that since 1993. So if you have an employee become ill and you need to replace them, or you have somebody leave unexpectedly, or you just have a vacancy that needs to be filled, or a skill set you need for a period of time, we can come in and help you with that. And we have principals across all sorts of different skill sets, not just HR. They include executive management, research and development, finance, sales and marketing, people and culture or HR, manufacturing, operations, mergers and acquisitions, and supply chain. We also lead projects from inception through to execution. We do work for not-for-profits and family enterprises to multinational corporations, and as small as fewer than 10 people to more than 1,000 employees, and organizations as smaller than 5 million to over 500,000 in size. So the presenters today, the first one is me. I'm Sarah Heisey. I'm a principal with the Osborne Group. I have an MBA in Human Resources and Marketing from Dalhousie University. I spent 7 years in marketing and sales and have spent more than 25 years in more senior human resource roles. Somebody told me once that once you get to 20 or 25 years, you no longer have to put the actual number. You can just add a plus sign. So I've chosen to put the plus sign in place. I had a corporate career in HR in the manufacturing industry. I worked for Kodak. I worked for Norbord, which was an engineered wood company, and I worked for Nexans, which was known in its original form in Canada as Canada Wire and Cable. A lot of people were familiar with that. I went into consulting in about 2011, and I joined the Osborne Group in 2014. I've worked in a lot of different sectors, for profit for sure, in manufacturing. And then in the not-for-profit sector, I've done work with legal aid clinics, community health, accessible housing, and developmental services, to name a few. Our second presenter today is Ahmed Sultan. He works on our HR team, and he is a Bachelor of Political Science. He has spent more than 20 years in key leadership positions in HR and has had a career in Fortune 500 companies. He's worked across every continent there is, and maybe not Antarctica, every other continent there is. And then and then he's worked in many different industries, including consumer packaged goods, education, technology, not-for-profit, and service industries. He's worked from companies as large as global organizations down to startups, and he's been an executive coach for a number of leaders. Our last presenter today, not the least, is Judy Fantham, and she's a principal with the Osborne Group. Judy has an honors Bachelor of Journalism and a Master's in Leadership and Training. She has been executive director of not-for-profits. She was a senior executive officer at the Ontario Nurses Association. She was a reporter, producer, and anchor for Canadian Broadcasting Corporation TV, as well as a national director of learning and development for CBC, and a regional director for CBC TV, Alberta and Saskatchewan. So she will be giving us the executive's perspective on STAY interviews. So first thing is, what is a STAY interview? Many of you are probably wondering that, or maybe you know a little bit about it, or maybe you're just guessing what it is. But a STAY interview is basically a structured conversation or discussion that you have. And it's a structured discussion that takes place between the leader and an individual that works for them. So a supervisor and a direct report would sit down and have a structured discussion. And the goal really is to learn about what actions a leader needs to take to strengthen the employee's engagement and retention. So the challenge that everybody has, it doesn't matter what client I talk to, I think with the exception maybe of one, but they still do some recruiting, is recruiting is such a big pain point for everybody. Everybody said, 5 years ago how hard it was to fill positions. It's even worse now, it seems. And so it's a pain point for everybody. So if you think about it, if you reduce the amount of turnover you have and increase your retention, you automatically reduce your recruiting. So that's the whole benefit of starting to work on stay interviews, but there are others. And so how do we go about doing this? Well, this webinar is basically going to introduce you to the concept of stay interviews and help you with the essential tools you need to retain your staff. And that is all about really engagement. So there's three benefits to stay interviews for a supervisor. First of all, because they're conducting the stay interview, they get immediate feedback from their staff. So you're sitting face to face with somebody, you ask them a question, they give you the answer, you have a chance to probe the answers they give you to get more information, and you know exactly what they need. And you hear from each individually employee on their own. So you don't get a congregate sort of set of information. You get a direct feedback, and you know that Mary needs this and John needs that and Susan needs this. And it also, by virtue of the fact that you're spending more time sitting down with an employee, having a conversation to understand what's important to them, you automatically will improve your supervisory relationship. And there's four reasons why we conduct stay interviews. One is to improve retention, reduce turnover. The second is to increase employee engagement, and that's a really key factor. And we'll talk about some statistics around that in a few minutes. It's to increase new hire engagement and to make sure you retain high performers. There's nothing more like a kick in the stomach than when you hear one of your best employees tell you they're resigning and leaving. It's just so devastating. And you want to make sure that if you have great performers, you hang on to them. So why is engagement so important? Well, engaged employees are more likely to stay with the organization, but not only that, they're way more productive. So if you have engaged employees working for you, you're going to have a higher level of productivity. One of the stats that we found was that millennial employees are the least engagement of all the workforce. And in the United States, and we can assume that this to some degree correlates with Canada, by 2025, which is a few months away, millennial employees will make up 75% of the US workforce. So if they're not engaged, we have to get them engaged. We cannot continue with them not being an engaged part of the community. And when employees are engaged, they're more fulfilled. So it benefits everyone, both the employer and the employee. And last of all, turnover, which is what happens when employees aren't engaged, is really expensive. So I'm not sure if you measure turnover or the cost of turnover, and there's all sorts of soft costs as well as hard costs to do with turnover. But, turnover diverts the organization from doing their strategic work. I can think of so many organizations I support where they're so busy trying to fill vacancies that they aren't actually pursuing their strategic plan or their mission or their goals. And it's also disruptive to the work environment. So it's upsetting that people are leaving. You have to train new people. Some mistakes are made. You go and have people limp along because they're trying to do multiple jobs at once. It reduces morale. People think, oh, I'm left here. Everybody has gone on to greener pastures. I'm just like a survivor left in the organization if they're not happy. Turnover costs money and time. And I've seen so many different ways of calculating turnover, and the most whatever striking thing that I saw was that turnover can be as high as 6% of your revenues or your annual operating budget, which is a phenomenally large number as far as I'm concerned. However, the good news is that the Harvard Business Review reports that a 5% increase in employee retention results in a 10% decrease in cost. So that's a pretty significant formula for trying to reduce your costs and based on retention and engagement. So why do supervisors conduct stay interviews? When I first started talking about these, people kept saying, well, can't HR just do this? Let's just have HR do stay interviews. It'd be much easier because the supervisors are so busy. But research says that the relationship that you have between the supervisor and your team or your employee is directly related to team engagement. I think every one of us can think about times where you've worked in a job where you weren't particularly engaged or you weren't particularly happy, and absolutely know that part of it had to do with your supervisor. And engagement strongly influenced by leadership behavior. So if you respect and like and trust your supervisor, you're likely to be more engaged. And those who have been interviewed say that those who work for highly engaged supervisors um, are less likely to indicate that they want to leave the organization within the next year. So typically, what do we do to figure out if employees are engaged? Well, we conduct surveys because that's sort of what we know what to do. And so we conduct a survey and then we build a program to respond to the requests that people have. And over time, the surveys are the same and the information that comes out of them is the same, and we don't get any new outcomes. And there's usually two different kinds of surveys. There's exit interviews or surveys, and there's employee experience surveys. So I'm just going to compare what exit interviews and employee experience surveys provide you versus a stay interview. So exit interviews are basically autopsies, but they're not as scientific. So you basically say to employees they're leaving, did you expect it was the job as you expected? What went wrong? Why are you leaving? And most of the time, the answer you get is, well, I've got a better opportunity. Employees are really reluctant to burn bridges as they leave an organization, or they can't be bothered to get into the detail because they're almost out the door. So you don't really get really good justification why people are leaving the organization. And if you talk to HR managers, me included, there isn't a lot that gets done with the results. The standard answer is, well, we call all the information, then we look for trends, and then we try and do something about it. Well, by the time you do that, the person's so far gone out the door, there's nothing you can do to save them, and you may not have saved many other people after that. But with stay interviews, you can really focus on the employees you want to keep. You really need to do them for all staff so that everybody feels treated equally. But you can say, okay, this is a really good performer. I really want to hear what they have to say. And you remove the middleman. So the employee and the supervisor are talking to each other. There's no one trying to dilute the information or change the information, how it's delivered from the employee to the employer. And the other thing is the employee hears from the employer, we want you to stay. What can we do to make you stay with us? And then the next steps are in the supervisor's hands. So I know supervisors can't change things like collective agreements. They can't change necessarily the benefits plan. They can't change some, major structural things in the organization, but they can hear what the employee has to say. And there's a lot of things that they can change themselves. So it gives them the opportunity to say, hey, that's not a big deal. I can deal with that. Or boy, everyone's complaining about XYZ. Let's see what we can do about it. When you compare employee surveys, which are still quite popular to stay interviews, an employee survey gives you a response of the average thinking, what everybody is saying, and then you get the results out of it. So you don't get to know what the top performers are saying. You don't actually know whether the ideas that they're putting in the survey are important or less important than one another because they aren't ranked in any way. And months pass between filling out the survey, analyzing the results, and then getting back to people with feedback on the survey. And it's really hard for supervisors to put action plans in place because they don't really know what their employees said. And often you'll be told, oh, yes, you rated the top employer out of all these different employers, but that doesn't help you with your problem. That just makes you feel good, like you're doing a good job. Whereas stay interviews, you hear what each person is saying, and you can understand what would create a situation where they might want to leave or where they're already contemplating leaving. And employees' priorities are clear and understood because you can probe and ask as many questions as you need to get the information from them that you require to understand what it is that will make them more engaged. Interviews and solutions can happen quickly. You can have a meeting with an employee right now and in an hour say, oh, okay, I found out this is a real sore spot, and go deal with it. And you don't have to wait for months to pass while you analyze survey results. The supervisor then becomes responsible for engagement and retention. So they take it on their shoulders to try and make sure that their employees are as engaged as possible. And now it doesn't matter what other survey says, it's down to each employee's relationship with their employees, each employers or leaders, a relationship with their employees that matters most. And you can actually get your statistics by supervisor and see where the supervisors are making significant impact. There is a really strong correlation between leadership and turnover, and I think that is the reason why stay interviews are so impactful. So the Saratoga Institute says that poor leadership causes 60% of all employee turnover. This statistic I've been using for ages. When you see a constant churn in an area with a specific supervisor, you have to think about, okay, what's going on in that leadership situation to cause turnover in that department? And then how long it takes, how long an employee stays and how productive they are is determined by their relationship with their manager. So if you don't click with your manager, or you don't find your manager is in any way engaged with the way you do your work or what you're doing, this person's not likely going to stay around. So it's important to measure the cost of turnover. And I said that there's lots of different ways of measuring it, and people measure everything from soft costs to hard costs, or you can just say, okay, these are the things we're going to measure. This is our KPI, and we're going to keep track of it. And it's really important to do this prior to starting stay interviews, so you know what your baseline is and you know what impact you've had with stay interviews. So it's really important to look at the total cost of turnover, however you define that, and the length of time people are in the organization before leaving. I see a lot of organizations now where they have really, really long tenure, 20, 25, 30 years tenure, and 2 and 3 year tenure. And there's this gap in between. You got to wonder what happened to all those people that were hired in between that have since left. And there is a question, will there be a recording? And the answer is yes. We can actually send you the slides. And if you like, the recording will be on our website. After you implement stay interviews, each manager should become accountable for engagement and retention of their staff, because they have the control now to understand what it is people need and try and address the issues. There's some things you can't address. As I mentioned before, you can't create a new collective agreement. You can't go find a new benefits plan. But there's a lot of things between the employee and the employer in their relationship and the way the work is done that can be addressed. The other thing is, I worked for an organization once where we had all kinds of metrics, crazy number of metrics. But we equated everything to the number of days of production that it costs. So if you need to make sure, if you're measuring things like turnover or turnover percentage or the time to recruit or engagement scores, that you make them meaningful, because just sending out statistics to people, they just sort of glaze over and look the other way. But if you were to say, well, it costs us 2 days of production costs or 1 week of supplying this program in order to replace the people that leave. And if we cut that by 25% or half, we get down to half a day's production or 1 day's production. That's a pretty tangible thing that people can understand. Really important, if you're going to provide data on turnover, to try and make it meaningful in some way. And there's probably things people refer to all the time as measurements that you can equate the cost as an equivalent. There's a really high correlation between trust and engagement and retention. Not surprisingly, if leadership skills are important for engagement and retention, trust is one of those things that sits with that. And 32% employees say their decision to stay with their employer is based on how much they trust their supervisor. And I know I worked for somebody who breached my trust once, and I was there about 3 more months while I looked for another job. And when I do this presentation to organizations, I do an exercise where I say to people, you don't have to share unless you want to, but think of time when your supervisor breached your trust. What happened? What was the end result? And pretty much every time, the person has eventually left. So it's a pretty key thing. And once you breach trust, it's so hard to regain it. So that's a really critical thing to keep in mind. And then Great Place to Work Institute says that 20 years of research has proven that the trust between managers and employees is a defining characteristic or primary characteristic of the very best workplaces. So a lot out there a lot in the literature that trust is absolutely critical. So now I'm going to hand things over to Ahmed, and he's going to take you through the essentials of stay interviews.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah have taken us through the why and what of the stay interview. So this is about the time to dive a little bit and see the how. So before going into this, just four steps. Once you start thinking of implementing the stay interview methodology in your organization, you need to focus on four main points and realize that those are essential to have a successful journey in retaining your employees. The first one, that employees would need to hear from their supervisors that they want them to stay. It's not a nice to have thing. It's a strategy. We want you to stay. We want you to be engaged, and we want you to perform at your peak. Second, supervisors need to understand that retaining and engaging employees is within their circle of influence. It's not something that is at the HR side or the management side. No, this is my role as a manager, and I can influence this. I can have my people staying engaged and happily performing. Once this happens, the employees would be more likely to accept the responsibility of them staying engaged. And all of this will happen only if this is surrounded by trust. So stay interviews is a tool that would be building trust within the organization, and it will maintain it as it's happening on a drum beat of happening once at least every year, and we'll come to the frequency in a second. If we move into more details. So there are around 6 features of the stay interviews. So we'll go through them one by one. So the first is this needs to happen in a one-to-one forum. So this is not a focus group. This is not a kind of a departmental meeting. This happens between the supervisor and the direct report. This is a discussion that is happening between both of them, and it's mainly focusing on the employee, not focusing on the department, not focusing on the agency or the company. It's only focusing on the employee. Second, that this needs to start from the top. The tone from the top is very important to make sure that this is successful. And here we mean that it needs to start by the senior leadership. They do it with their teams, and then their teams would be doing it with the rest of the organization. So expecting everyone within the organization to be part of this stay interview, maybe the exception would be the CEO or the ED, where they do not have a direct supervisor or a direct manager that would be doing the stay interview with them. The third point is this needs to happen in a face-to-face forum. It needs to happen in person. We all know that after the pandemic, a lot a lot of us and a lot of organizations have moved to either a virtual setup or a hybrid setup, but whenever possible, do it in an in-person format, not virtually and not over the phone. If for any reason logistically you cannot do it in person, please avoid doing it over the phone. I don't think that that would be anything like worse than having this kind of discussion that is revolving around an employee that we want to stay and to perform than doing it in a way where it comes casually as unprepared, like a phone conversation. Very importantly as well, that this is not a secret. We're not trying to do something in a casual format or informal. No, you need to be very upfront with your people and tell them exactly what are the expectations out of this interview. What is the expectation? What is the purpose? You need also to make sure that the goals are clear out of this, so people would be staying longer and feeling engaged in their work. So this is your ultimate goal out of this. So say it upfront and make sure that they do understand that within the discussion you will not have answers for all the questions, and you might need to have a follow-up interview or a follow-up connect. Also, it's very important that we should avoid mixing up stay interviews and performance reviews or performance management. The stay interview has nothing to do with the performance of the employees. So actually, if you're planning to have your annual performance review happening in December, make sure that the stay interviews will be happening somewhere around June, July. If it's vice versa, then do it. But don't couple it together, and make sure that you do not slip during the stay interview into performance talk. This is not the forum for performance review. This is the forum for engaging, making sure that you're capturing the right points of how can you make your people stay engaged. One of the features also that you need to be aware of, don't share the questions upfront. So this is not a forum where someone need to impress the other. So you're not sending them the questions so they can come and prepare. It's more of a genuine conversation. And it needs to be a genuine conversation, which means that we do not plan the questions. We might plan the questions, but we do not send it upfront so people can be like prepared. Otherwise, they would have been sending it over email, and we capture the learning. So questions need to be on the spot, needs to be genuine, and you need to be prepared for probing question to better understand. Saying that, you can definitely use a scripted opening, which is totally different than sending the questions up front. So the scripted opening could have things around why are we doing this? Who will be involved? Everyone is part of it. What is the intent out of it? How would I reply throughout the interview if there will be any more follow-ups? So you can have your own scripted opening, but please make sure that while you're doing this, you continue to be genuine, continue to be authentic, and continue to be yourself. Don't do it in a piece of paper that will be distributed across the entire organization, because just like we know when someone is not authentic, our people would know if this is not our character. So who are the target audience for the stay interview? So remember, we said it's starting from the top, cascading down to the entire organization. So everyone within the organization is in scope of the stay interview. However, you might want to start with a smaller group as a pilot. But this is just like Pringles. Once you start, you should not stop. So once you start, you should continue. Do the pilot. Make sure that you capture the learning, but you continue cascading it down to the entire organization. Who would you start with? You can decide to start with a certain group of people that either are about to retire, or new hires, or an area where you have a high turnover or a risk of losing talents, or an area where you have very niche kind of skill sets that you want to make sure people are being retained, or a certain department that has been through a lot of challenges over the past period and you want to start with them. Again, so defining who to start with is something, but making sure that it's cascaded for the entire organization is something else, and both need to go hand in hand. Just keep in mind, you cannot target a group of high performers and say, this would be my target group or pilot group, because guess what? And you're all experts and have been managing an organization for too long. Top performers, they know that they're top performers. Their colleagues and the entire organization know that they're top performers. If you just targeted this group, everyone else will be disengaged and saying, okay, this organization is only focusing on those group of people, and I have no skin in the game. I don't want to be part of this organization. So make sure that this tool, the stay interview tool, does not turn out to be a tool against what you want to do. So make sure that you're not focusing on those only, but you're focusing on everyone. Definitely, as a leader, you want your high performers to be well retained and well engaged, but those are not the only group in the organization that you want them to stay. And the other thing to keep in mind, or the other tip, make sure that when you cascade down through the organization, try to do it all at the same time. So to avoid also people saying in an organization, oh, they're only focusing on the sales people or only focusing on the marketing people. No, you want everyone to be included as part of this. Sometimes you will be challenged by managers who are either a little bit on the slow side of actioning things, or they would be more of very busy or have a lot on their plate at this point of time. So, in order to counter this, make sure that you have an action plan with a deadline for each and every manager to finalize the stay interviews with all their direct reports. So, those are some guides for the stay interview. So, how can you plan for it? So, make sure that you prepare your opening script. It doesn't need to be the same opening script every time. So when you start, you will learn by time to change it. Just think of it like when you're interviewing candidates. You always have an opening script, but by time, by experience, you start to add to it, remove part of it to make sure that the candidates are there, happy, engaged, and telling you what you want to know about them. So the same will happen with the C interview. Prepare your opening script. Make sure that you amend it as you go. Make sure that you have some prepared questions to ask, but be agile and flexible enough if the discussion is taking you somewhere else to ask other questions. Probing questions to be prepared is very important, and make sure that you're taking notes and you have your area of notes being assessed. So this is not a coffee discussion. This is not a nice chat with a friend. This process is a business organization process that have an intent and it has a follow-up after. So the frequency of the stay interview, I would say it depends, with the minimum of one stay interview for every employee every year. However, as a leader, you might decide that for a certain group or for a certain employee, you might want to engage on stay interviews in a more frequently manner. If the market is not in its best shape, or the organization or the smell of the place is not the smell of the place that you would like to see within the organization, you might decide to do it more frequently. Try again, this is a very important thing. This is not a performance review. So please try to avoid using the same performance review season for the stay interviews so people don't get mixed up. For the new hires specifically, and all data is saying that the first 9 to 12 months of their employment is where they decide to engage or disengage from the organization. So you might want to make sure that for the new hire, this is happening 30 days after they join, and maybe a follow-up after 30 days. And you can decide, maybe for the first year, you would be ending up having 4 stay interviews. So that you can keep them on the radar. So, and just remember the time when you were a new hire and how much harder it was for you to talk to your manager about the reasons to stay or the reasons to leave. It's not an easy thing, but if they see it happening more frequently, this would build more trust and they would be more open to share with you what gets them to stay and what gets them to get engaged. Your role as a supervisor within this process of the stay interview, I would say it's a role of an active listener. So 80% of the time you should be listening. And by listening, I mean active listening. So asking the question, taking time to understand, asking the right probing questions that would make the people tell you more, and you capture in the responses that they have, rather than ending up trying to convince them how beautiful the place that we're working in or how bad it is. No, this is not the intent. The intent is to listen to them and know how they feel so you can put the right actions in the future. So we have talked quickly about the notes and what to capture. So you need to look at this as a business process where you capture the outcome of the stay interviews. So you would be looking at summaries, and this summaries should be it would start with the manager by the individual, but you can collectively aggregate them by a department and by an organization wide, which means that we need as a leadership team to agree on what each and every manager will need to capture, what they need to consolidate from their team, so you can understand that this is an individual thing that we need to tackle in a certain way, or it's more a wide program that we might need to tackle differently within a certain group of people. You need also to make sure that you have a mechanism to monitor those results and how can they get aggregated together and collected in a way that would enable you to action them. So remember, just like any PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act cycle, you need to end up with an action plan. Otherwise, it will be a fancy, nice thing that would have no meaning and it will be a waste of time for everyone. So focus on the action plan, but in order to do this, you need to define where is the issue and how can you do it. So monitoring the results of the stay interview is one thing. Monitoring the quality of it is another thing. Also, you would want to measure the impact on the overall organization by seeing how would this be affecting the retention. Sarah got us some very nice statistics, but you might be beating the statistics, or you might be not doing very well. So you need to change it and make sure that this is working in the benefit of your organization. So those are some helpful resources that you might want to equip yourself with before getting into the stay interviews. And again, they might vary from one organization to the other. So those in front of you on the screen are some of those tools that you want to familiarize yourself with before getting into the stay interviews. Things like the policies, what developmental opportunities, what succession staffing would be looking like, some skills that the organization is looking at, or what certain specific skills for the individual is lacking in order for them to get promoted or to get moved to the next level. What discussions with senior management need to happen before, so you might need to understand better on the direction if you're not on the top of the organization. Make sure that you're aware of it. Even some was talking about the new generation and how hard it is to get them engaged and retained. So if you go to the next slide, we'll be talking about the flexibility of policies that you're having within the organization. If there is any kind of tuition educational fund or tuition fees reimbursement, what is the salary increase process, the comp and ban activities that's happening on the organization. So all of those are more of tools that you might want to equip yourself with before getting into the discussion. And it will be very helpful that you answer on the spot. But just one final thought on this. If you do not have the answer, it's fine. You can come and say, you know what, we need to schedule a follow-up, and they go and check on those policies and those systems, and they will get back to you. So make it more of a genuine care to your employees more than it's a robot answering questions. With this, I want to pass it to Judy to give you the executive perspective.
Great. Thank you very much, Ahmed. I find say interviews are not only mission critical, I love doing them. And just before I go into the reasons why, I want to go back to what Sarah said a number of minutes ago around exit interviews versus stay interviews. Exit interviews for me, they're very negative. They're all reactive. You're looking back at what's broken. And often it's things you can no longer change. And it's heartbreaking if I lose a high performer. But the stay interview, it's future focused. And it's all about stuff that I can change. And it's all about relationship building. So here are some of the things. Sarah gave us a list of 4 factors, 4 benefits to say interviews. And I'd like to expand that to 8. And these come from personal experience. High performers will stay. If they're talking, in my case with the CEO or ED, they say, wow, I'm having voice. They're listening to my opinion. Low performers self-select out. I've had this happen when you get talking to someone about their career ambitions and they start to realize that maybe they're not aligned with where the organization is going. Providing context facilitates future performance management. As Ahmed said rightly, this is not a performance management conversation, but it will give you the context or help give you the context for that discussion 6 months down the road. It can enhance performance turnarounds. I had a wonderful example 2 years ago where someone had felt that they had been ignored by a past supervisor. So we had a conversation about what they wanted to do, what she aspired to do. And I said, okay, well, let's try that. And I gave her some support. And within about 1 year, she had not only turned around her performance, she was promoted and she had a higher salary. It builds team cohesion. People have a better sense of where the organization is going, how they want to fit into where the organization is going. It can unleash hidden talent, passion, or drive. You learn things about more of a holistic perspective of the employee, and you'll learn things about them you may not have known before. It can enhance my effectiveness and reputation. And I'll give you a great example of that when we get to a case study. And it also helps me avoid what I like to say, goo on my shoe. It can uncover some organizational risks. So if a supervisor is maybe not being as attentive to their staff, that can come out in a stay interview. And I can pay attention to that. And maybe that will help me keep a good staff member. So I have found all of these to be true. Now, in preparation for this webinar, I actually did a focus group with some former staff about what inspires staff to say. And these answers, I think, really contain some nuggets for how you can model the way in a stay interview. So first of all, in a stay interview, they're looking for leadership, passion, and action. And we heard that loud and clear from Ahmed. Take lots of notes. This is a business process. This isn't just a conversational coffee. They want to see that you're going to act, as well as being excited about the organization and about them. When you're talking to high performers, you may learn in a stay interview that they want autonomy and respect. But if you're dealing with newcomers, newbies, or people who are in a new position, they may be asking for greater guidance or mentoring. They want you to know in a stay interview that they have responsibilities beyond work, and they want you to listen attentively and be prepared to be flexible. What else keeps an employee staying is authentic acknowledgement. So not the generic way to go team, but rather specifically, now I understand what your team is doing for the organization. Here's where you did well specifically. Appreciate the behind the scenes contributions. A stay interview, you're meeting, well, in my case, the organizations in which I was conducting stay interviews, I was dealing with a lot of frontline people. And it was very exciting for them and for me to be able to talk to someone on the front lines who might not necessarily be meeting with the CEO or the ED. They also want to use the stay interview as an opportunity to advocate for themselves. They perhaps want to ask about, I'm on contract. What would it take to go on full time? I'm worried about my pay. What would it take to move up in the organization? And benefits, they may be asking about benefits, but as Ahmed said, you'll have the policies on your hand to be able to talk to them about that. And I also love stay interviews because they can lead to hallway conversations. I can now meet someone in the hallway and I know a little bit more about them and I can have just an informal conversation with them. So here is a case study. And this was an organization. I was working for a large public sector organization and I was recruited to run a very small not-for-profit of 22 people, excited to do so. And I felt it was my time to give back. And the case or the cause really spoke to me. This poor organization had gone months without an executive director. They had been shut down by a fire temporarily. They were facing financial challenges because the executive director prior had been hiring acquaintances into unfunded positions. I was facing 3 human rights cases before the Ontario Human Rights Commission because of past leadership style, and they had recently unionized. And I worked in many, many unionized environments, and I will tell you, unions happen for a reason. So what I did was I conducted one-on-one stay interviews with every single staff member. OpMed sort of gave you a process for how you can conduct these. It was such a small organization, 24 people. I had a sign-up sheet on my door. There was no fear of a hidden agenda. So just book time with me. And I asked them essentially, how can we survive and thrive as an organization? What would success look like for us? What do you need from me to succeed? What do you need from me to stay? And I heard some very difficult truths. So I decided to do an employee survey, and I used an organization called the Nonprofit Employer of Choice Awards. And the very first year, the unvarnished truth was really difficult, and we did not win, but it gave me a benchmark. So what I did was, as OpMed said, I took copious notes. I fed back to the staff. Here are the themes I heard from the stay interviews. Here's my action plan. And within 2 years, we won a Nonprofit Employer of Choice Award. And I'm telling you, it felt really good. And this was a quote from Jeff Doran, who is the president of that organization. And he said, we've never seen a score increase that much year over year. And this isn't an accolade for me. It's about the team and it's about the process for stay interviews, because I reviewed the data, I communicated the results to staff, staff shared authentically with me. We had a work plan in place. And when we did the second round of surveying of employees, that's why we won the award. So that was very, very exciting. What I've learned over the years is stay interviews require open communication. Ahmed used the word authentic, and he's bang on. And follow through. Absolutely critical that there's follow through. And what open communication and follow through lead to is trust. And that's so important, because that's what you need, is trust in building relationships with your team. Now, I thought it might be helpful to sort of give you kind of my flow of stay interview questions. So you can create your own specific questions, but I find I usually open with, talk to me about your job and what's expected of you. Is it manageable? Are you satisfied with your job? What do you like about it? Then that typically leads to career development. Well, in 3 to 5 years, here's where I'd like to be. Oh, isn't that interesting? So do you think you're going to get there? What do you think it will take? Well, it might take me a bit longer because my work-life balance is out of skew. I have 3 young children at home. I'm a parent. So it might take me a little longer. Interesting. Are you finding you're able to manage your work life despite that? That often leads to a conversation about what's communication like in your team. My supervisor is super flexible. My supervisor is not flexible. Oh, that's very interesting. Well, what's it like on the team then? You learn about the team dynamic, which typically leads to a broader conversation about the work environment. Well, what's it like to work in our agency or organization? That usually flows into organizational culture. I love this culture. It's extremely supportive. People can thrive. People can move up in the organization. Or conversely, there isn't communication. And always, 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 I end with, what do you need from me? How can I make your life better in this organization? I always end with that. And I do think it's really important to stress what Ahmed said about 80%. It's active listening 80% of the time. This is about your staff. This isn't about me. So that just gives you a sense of the flow. In summation for me, and why I love stay interviews, and I don't think it's just because I'm a journalist and I love to interview people. I love building two-way trust. So as a leader, I love to create that safe space that allows for that trust to exchange truths two-way, but in a constructive way. And it begins from an appreciative place that the employee has valuable input. I don't care where they are in the organization. I know I can learn from them. And it begins with that. And I never want a stay interview to end in a negative place. I will always try to reframe. So rather, what's broken in the organization, what's right, and how can we build on that? So that's why I love stay interviews, and I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Judy. I really appreciate your perspective from a management point of view. So if you are challenged with turnover and recruiting and want to address retention and engagement, we can help you by leading you through the steps that you need to complete stay interviews, talk to your management staff and train them, help you prepare the needed tools, whatever you need. You're welcome to reach out to us and we'd be happy to help you out so that you can bring these into your organization. We're now going to go over to questions. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see the questions. I do also have to do a commercial, not a paid commercial announcement, but a commercial announcement. On October 23rd, we have our finance team also doing a webinar. They will be marketing it the same way we reached out to you this way through. But if you want to share it with the finance people in your organization, by all means. So it's October 23rd at the same time at noon. Okay, what questions are there out there? I know Judy was responding to the chat. I don't know if we're totally up to date on the chat. Any questions before I get through this, start going through the chat?
Yeah. So one of the questions was what happens if the supervisors feels that they do not have the ability to make change sphere of responsibility? What tips to help supervisors do this?
Well, so that's a great question. And we probably get that question every time we present this. And so when when we train management teams to cascade this down through the organizations, one of the things we prepare is a list of things you can and cannot influence. So, the collective agreement, whatever's in there, or the benefits plan, or different policies that already exist. So there are things you can't impact, but there's a lot of things you can impact. So when you get a question like, well, I want to know how I can earn more money, but I'm already at the top of my scale, you can write that down and perhaps aggregate that kind of information and return it to your supervisor and HR to let them know that people are asking questions. And maybe there's an answer that, we're going to do 2.5% increase to base next year, or it's coming, or there's a revision every so often. But those are the kind of things that you can't necessarily impact, but you can answer questions. And sometimes just merely answering the question about the how or the why helps employees. Hopefully that answered whose ever question that was. Just work my way. Now there's a Q&A. Yes, great question. How do you answer questions about salary increases when there aren't any? So this is where I always go back to trying to make sure you don't sell the value of the job solely on the pay, because you're never going to win that battle, especially if you're in a not-for-profit, because they just don't seem to have unlimited budgets. But I don't think I worked for any for-profit organizations that had unlimited budgets either. But I think it's really important to make sure that you acknowledge that the person understands that there is no increase in pay. So make sure that's clear, but talk about all the other things that are beneficial in the organization. And one of the things that I really think organizations need to do, and it parallels this really well, is to put together an employee proposition about what the value is working for that organization. So it could be experience-based, it could be the reward that you get from working for a certain type of, whether it's a charity or organization that does something for good, or the other side benefits that you might get, whether it's some perks or it's your benefits plan or whatever. There's usually something to promote. Not everybody is totally motivated by money. So one of the benefits of the stay interviews is what would keep you here? What motivates you to be here? And then redirect the question from it's all about salary to other things that are really important.
Sherry had her hand up.
Oh, Sherry.
Thank you, Judy. That last question really hit on mine. So Sarah, in your response, you got to what I was wondering. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
We have one more question from Dawn. What are some tricks and tips you have used to keep the conversation positive and future thinking? She's
that's
highlighting more the healthcare side.
Yeah, that's a great question, because The conversations can be negative, but I think it's important when you ask your question. You usually set up 5 questions when you do these interviews, and you may change them as you get further and further into doing stay interviews. So you want to ask positive things, but also you'll get negative answers. So you may say to people, well, what do you look forward coming to work every day? And they say, well, nothing. And then you need to probe that and find out, well, if there's nothing, why do you come to work? What is your motivator? So it's just really about getting to know the employee and what's important to them. And if coming to work is a miserable experience, find out why. Maybe it's because the commute is long or whatever, but try and probe that a little further and try and, look for the positive. So if somebody's very negative, some people are just naturally negative. I tend to be cup half full type of person, but not everybody is. So try and look for the positive in things. I see.
And Sarah,
Yeah.
could I just add, and I know
Sure.
John's hand is up, but I wanted to add, I actually have a book called The Art of the Positive Question. But, and I'm not trying to sound Pollyannish here, but what I often find is if someone says, what motivates you to come to work? Well, nothing. Well, can you think back to a time when you did feel motivated to come to work?
Exactly.
And what were the factors and conditions that made you feel that way?
Yeah.
So it's trying to recreate when did you have a good time coming to work?
Yeah. That's a great point. Jocelyn?
Yeah, so what happens, and I'm pretty sure this could be on a lot of people's minds because it was the first thing that popped into my mind, is okay, so I'm going to be focusing on stay interviews. I want people to stay. But what happens if I have that one performer that just, oh my God, can you please leave?
Really?
I
There's
don't want
such
him to
people out
stay
there?
or her to stay.
Well, and I think Judy mentioned this, where employees will self-select out when they realize they're not a good fit in the organization. They will self-select out. I always say you need a variety of employees in your organization. You need those high performers, but you need the plotters too, the ones that just sort of get their job done and they're there every day,
Yeah.
mostly, and they just do their work. And the ones that aren't great performers, we back in the day when I first started in HR, I remember we had an HR manager at one of our plants in Northern Ontario, and she would actually, if she had an employee that was a poor performer, she would have conversations with them about, what's going on? Like, why are you struggling with this? Why is this hard for you? Why are you doing this? And help them think about the skills that they like to use and they're really good at. And that often led to them concluding that maybe it was time for them to get a different kind of job. So she wouldn't necessarily lead them out the door, but she was really, really, really good at having these conversations to make people realize that, maybe this isn't the right place for you or the right situation. I have an example. I have a relative, I won't say who is not a really good timekeeper and doesn't like the structure of a 9 to 5 day. So I remember years ago saying to them, then don't get a job like at a bank where you have to, or an office where you have to be there from 9 to 5. You need a job where you have some flexibility, or you can consult, or you can do something different. Because if you can't be to work every day at the same time and leave at the same time and like that structure, you're going to fight it your entire career. And for years, they kept getting jobs where it was sort of 9 to 5 kind of thing, and they fought it the whole time. And then finally, somebody offered them a job which had a completely different schedule, and suddenly they loved their work. Isabella.
You're on mute, Isabella.
You're on mute, Isabella.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, it's so good to see some familiar faces. Question: as I'm listening to the interview, to this presentation, when I do stay interviews, I normally send the questions to my invitees, and I've seen here that you should not do that. So this is a kind of messing up a little bit of my process. However, a question here is: what are the pros and cons, and is it terribly wrong to do so?
So let me take that. So my first answer, if it has been successful, then definitely it's not terribly wrong. So if it has been working, so this is not a holy book. However, the intent out of not sending the questions upfront is to make sure that the discussion is happening natural. So sometimes we get hooked in finding the answers to our questions. And our direct reports are always in the mindset of, I need to answer the questions of my manager. So this is a very normal human thing. So if you're not sending the questions up front and you're asking them, and remember, so you need to take this in context. We're having a one-to-one, face-to-face discussion, sitting together in a room. So when the questions are asked naturally during this one-to-one discussion, it reflects the authenticity and the genuine care about it, about the individual, and it allows us also the flexibility of probing more or ending up the entire 1 hour or that is booked on one question, and we don't need to move to the other question. We might schedule them later. So this is why we're always recommending not to send the questions upfront, not to get hooked in. I need to satisfy my manager's need. The meeting is about the individual, not the manager.
Nice.
And I was just going to add, it's not a test. And some people, when they get a list of questions to answer, they answer them like it's a test. I think we all went to school for way too many years, and so we're used to answering like that. So you do want it to be very genuine. The other thing I've found is if you ask somebody, well, what makes you happy as you're coming to work every day? Sometimes, especially when you first do these, people don't know the answer. They're like, oh, I don't know. Well, I don't know what the answer is. But the more you ask the questions and the more you keep asking about how they think and how they feel and what's important to them, the more they're going to be able to enunciate what it is that they need. So the very first time you go through this experience, you may find, okay, I didn't get a lot of meat here, but they may come back to you or stop you in the hallway and say, you asked me this question. Well, today I was thinking about how excited I was about the fact that we're having a potluck lunch because it gives me a chance to talk to the people I don't work with every day. So it's amazing how things start coming up once you start the juices flowing in their minds. Any other questions? Well, we're 5 minutes over time, but I thank everybody for coming.